Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today we're going to be talking about Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting what I'm calling a mega Dickens read-along, where we read all of the works of Charles Dickens, all of his full-length novels, in publication order. And in December we read Oliver Twist, which is the second of Dickens's books. So today I'm going to be talking about my thoughts about Oliver Twist, having reread it very recently. This is my third reading of Oliver Twist, and I have a few different thoughts. This video is going to be spoilery, but not until later on, so I'll let you know when the spoilers start. Basically, there are a few different things I want to talk about, and when I get onto the themes, I feel like I will need to introduce some spoilers, but until then, this will be relatively spoiler-free. So Oliver Twist, if you don't know, is the story of Oliver Twist, a young boy who is brought up in a workhouse, who is sent away to a not very nice apprenticeship, from which he runs away and ends up in London getting involved with the wrong sort of people, and getting involved with a gang of thieves, and everything kind of goes on from there. Oliver Twist is obviously one of Dickens's most famous works. It's very well known and very popular, and it's not my favourite Dickens book. It's never been my favourite. It's always been my least favourite Dickens book, and I feel like rereading it this time, it is still my least favourite Dickens book. I listened to this on audiobook. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Jonathan Pryce, which I did like, and it was enjoyable on audiobook. I didn't have like the best audiobook experience because I slightly rushed through it at the end because it had been included in Audible's like collection, and then it was going off Audible's collection like when I had 7 hours left. So I kind of binged like the last half of Oliver Twist, which I feel like wasn't the best thing to do because the ending is my favourite bit. But there we go. I still did enjoy my reading of Oliver Twist. It's Dickens. I always love Dickens. But Oliver Twist is still not my favourite, and it's still, yeah, my least favourite. I feel like there are a few things. I feel like there are other things I discussed in the video I made introducing Oliver Twist at the start of the month. You know, there's no escaping the fact that there is quite a bit of anti-Semitism in Oliver Twist, and that kind of does impact the reading experience. And then I still think that Oliver as a character is a little bit bland. I felt kind of slightly fonder of Oliver reading it this time, but I still felt that he was a little bit boring. And the thing I was thinking throughout Oliver Twist is that I just feel like it's less interesting than all of Dickens's other books. Like I do think there are some great things in it, and I do think there are some really interesting things about it, but I just feel like it's less interesting than Dickens's other books. But I did find it really interesting to read it this time, reading it kind of in order, thinking about the fact that this is only Dickens's second novel, and also this is the book he wrote after the Pickwick Papers, which is a novel, but only kind of just a novel. The Pickwick Papers is very episodic, whereas Oliver Twist has like a much more overarching plot, I suppose. And I was thinking maybe one of the reasons why I don't think Oliver Twist is that great is because it was Dickens' second novel and he was still learning how to do novels. And also because I feel like he was trying very hard to do something which wasn't the Pickwick Papers. And the Pickwick Papers have been a big success, so I kind of understand why he was trying something very different, but I feel like that means that there are some things that I love by Dickens which aren't in Oliver Twist. I feel like you can kind of see in Oliver Twist that Dickens is still kind of finding his way when it comes to plotting and pacing. I feel like Oliver Twist has a fairly slow beginning and middle, and then the ending is fantastic, and I feel like the ending is so much better than the rest of Oliver Twist, that I wonder if that's because Dickens was still like, you know, it was fairly early on in his career. He was kind of still learning how to pace and plot. I also feel like, so Oliver Twist isn't that short, but it feels short to me, and I think maybe that's because it is short for a Dickens novel in comparison to his other books, and therefore it doesn't have like the tons of different characters, lots of interweaving plots that I love in so many of Dickens's other books. Like it feels a bit short for me. Again, I do wonder if that may be because I binged through the end of the audiobook because I wanted to listen to it before I had to pay extra money for it on Audible. So, you know, maybe that's on me rather than Oliver Twist, but I did feel that this time around. I also feel like Oliver Twist is obviously very heavy on the social criticism. In Oliver Twist, Dickens is obviously heavily criticising the workhouses and the upbringing that Oliver has there, but he's also criticising kind of the state of society as a whole that drives people like Bill and Fagin and Nancy to steal, and people like Charlie Bates and the Artful Dodger, you know, who are very young. And I mean, I don't think we actually know how old Nancy is, but I assume Nancy is quite young too. Like, I feel like I feel like considering Rose is 17 and Nancy and her, I feel like they are meant to be a similar age, so I feel like Nancy is probably also under 20, but I'm not 100% certain about that. Like, Oliver Twist is full of social criticism. I'll talk about this in a bit more depth later on in the video, but I feel like in Oliver Twist, Dickens really wanted to write a social critique book, which means that some of the social criticism is like a little bit heavy-handed in comparison, I think, to some of his other later books. Like, I feel like one of the reasons why I don't love Oliver Twist is because Oliver Twist isn't really a character. He is a vehicle for social criticism. He is a small innocent child that you must feel sorry for because bad things are happening to him, which kind of serves its purpose within the book, but I feel like later Dickens is able to have fantastic characters and wonderful social criticism and kind of combine all those things, whereas I feel like in Oliver Twist, he kind of, in making Oliver Twist a character who is a vehicle for social criticism, then Oliver Twist doesn't really have a kind of personality in his own right. Like, if I compare Oliver Twist to Joe from Bleak House, when we get to Bleak House, Joe is a young boy who is impoverished and living on the streets in Bleak House and suffering. And Joe is a vehicle for social critique, but he's also a character. And I think he's a much more developed character than Oliver Twist. And I feel like later on in Dickens's career, he's able to combine like wonderful plotting, great characterization and social critique much better than he is in Oliver Twist. Saying that, I do think that Bill and Nancy are well characterised as well as being vehicles for social critique. But there we go. The other thing I was thinking about Oliver Twist as a social critique novel is I feel like The Pickwick Papers is so funny, and I feel like Dickens wanted to write a serious book after The Pickwick Papers. He wanted to write this serious social critique, which means that Oliver Twist lacks a lot of the humour that other Dickens books have. I feel like later on in Dickens's career, he has a much like better balance between the humour and the dark stuff, whereas I feel like there's less of that in Oliver Twist. There are a few like comic moments, like obviously Mr. Bumble is sort of ridiculous in a terrifying way, and Mrs. Corney, I want to say her name is kind of entertaining too. And I also really like Mr. Brownlow's friend, Mr. Grimwig, who repeatedly says that he'll eat his own head. He's very entertaining, but I feel like he is one of the few characters who is solely comic. Like, I feel like Oliver Twist has a lot less comedy than some other Dickens novels. And maybe I partly think that because I've listened to it just after listening to The Pickwick Papers, which is like laugh out loud funny like every few pages. Whereas Oliver Twist just doesn't have that same Dickensian joy and humour that I love, and I feel like that is because Dickens was kind of writing it in opposition to The Pickwick Papers, trying to write this like serious novel that had a very different tone. So I feel like it's quite interesting to think about Oliver Twist in terms of it being a very early book and kind of Dickens still finding his way and finding like the balance, and maybe that's why I don't like Oliver Twist as much as Dickens' other books, because one thing I love about his books is the balance he has between light and shade, between humour and sorrow, and between social criticism and amazing characterisation and plots. And maybe in Oliver Twist, Dickens just like hadn't quite found the balance yet, or the balance that I like, I suppose. I don't know. Anyway, I was thinking about the plot and the pacing of Oliver Twist, because like I said, I feel like it does feel short to me. And it's not that it's a short book, but I feel like maybe not as much happens as I would expect in a book that is the length of Oliver Twist. I don't know. I feel like some elements of the plot of Oliver Twist are really good. Basically, I do think that Fagin and Bill and Nancy and the plot lines kind of involving the criminal gang in London I find quite interesting. I feel like it takes Oliver Twist a little bit of time to get to London, and it's less exciting before he gets to London. But I feel like the stuff in London with the gang is really, really interesting. I also feel like the Mr. Monks subplot, I won't say more than that at this stage. I won't talk about spoilers yet, but I feel like that subplot is quite interesting too, though maybe it's a little bit underdeveloped. And I quite like the Mr. Brownlow sections, but I find like the Rose and Harry Maylie sections less exciting. I find Rose and Harry and that kind of subplot much less exciting, so I feel like Oliver Twist does kind of drag a little bit in the middle, and I feel like Dickens is much better at his plotting and pacing when it comes to actually not the stuff about Oliver, but the stuff about the other characters around Oliver and the stuff about the gang in London, basically. I do feel like the pacing isn't perfect and the plotting isn't necessarily perfect, but I do think that there are some wonderful things in the end, and I feel like the ending of Oliver Twist is really, really good, and is kind of Dickens coming into his own and kind of writing some of his great climactic scenes that do work really well. I want to talk a little bit about characterization in Oliver Twist. Obviously, I have already mentioned that I find Oliver as a character a little bit bland, and maybe that's okay. That is maybe the point of him, and I did feel a bit fonder of Oliver this time around reading it, but I still do feel that he is much less well characterized than and written, I suppose, than other children in Dickens's later works. I feel like there are some fantastic characters in Oliver Twist. Mostly, I think Bill, Sikes and Nancy are really, really well done characters. Obviously, like, Bill's not a nice character, but I do feel like he is well characterised, and Nancy too. And I sort of feel like Fagin is. I don't know. I was thinking about this reading it this time, because I think that the difficulty with discussing Fagin as a character and thinking about him as a character is that it's very difficult to separate him as a character from the anti-Semitism with which Dickens writes about him, basically. And so it's kind of hard to think about him as a character and to what extent he is a developed character or to what extent he is kind of a jumble of Victorian stereotypes, I suppose. But I do feel like there are moments where he is quite interesting, and I feel like the power dynamics between him and Bill and Nancy and the Arthur Dodger and Charlie Bates, and like the power dynamics of the gang, are quite interesting, and the kind of characterization of the gang as a whole and the individuals within the gang are quite interesting. However, I do feel like the characters outside of the gang are not very exciting. Obviously Oliver is not so great, but yeah, Rose and Mrs. Maylie, Mr. Brownlow, like, I just find them not very exciting. I just feel like there are less of those kind of like lovable Dickensian characters that I want in Oliver Twist. I feel like Mr. Grimwig, who is a really minor character, is like one of the few characters who I find sort of lovable. This time around I was paying more attention to Charlie Bates, because I remember Charlie Bates as being quite important, and I think it's interesting that the Artful Dodger has like a place in popular culture. Like, I feel like the Artful Dodger is like almost as famous as Oliver Twist as a character, probably more so, but Charlie Bates isn't. But actually Charlie Bates in the novel is as important as the Artful Dodger, if not maybe even more important. And I quite like Charlie Bates as a character. I think he's quite interesting, especially his kind of role in the ending. I feel like there are a lot of really interesting themes in Oliver Twist, and at this point I am going to go into some more spoilery stuff, so if you haven't read Oliver Twist, maybe step away from the video now. But I think there are a few different themes that are really interesting in Oliver Twist. I feel like the theme of social mobility is really interesting in Oliver Twist, because Oliver kind of moves through class a lot, and this is actually something you do see in a lot of Dickens's later novels too, where a character kind of moves through different class positions, because Oliver Twist, you know, obviously has been brought up in the workhouse. He is sort of within the Victorian underclass, and then he goes to London, he runs away, he ends up with the wrong people, but then when he is looked after by Mr. Brownlow, he is kind of elevated, and later when he's looked after by Rose and Mrs. Maylie, then he is kind of, you know, given lessons and educated and wearing finer clothes as though he is like a young gentleman's son. But then he also like says he wants to do errands for Rose, so like, is he being like an adopted son of the family, or is he also kind of like a servant? And I feel like the line between those things is a little bit blurred. So I feel like it's kind of interesting to look at like Oliver's class position over the course of the book. And then at the end of the book we find out that Oliver is the son of a gentleman, and therefore, you know, that elevates him socially, but actually he is the illegitimate son of a gentleman, and that kind of means that his social position is much more ambiguous and lower. And actually the issue of illegitimacy in Oliver Twist is something I find quite interesting, because I had in my head, I don't know why, it has been quite a few years since I read Oliver Twist, but I had in my head that he was the legitimate son of Mr. Monks' father, and that Mr. Monks was the illegitimate one. I don't know why I had that the wrong way around in my head. I had in my head that Oliver was proved to be legitimate at the end, but actually he isn't. And actually I think that's very important, because illegitimacy was still a really big deal in the Victorian period, and I feel like it's quite important that Dickens is fighting against the kind of stigma around illegitimacy, as indeed he does in other novels later on in his career, but also that he spends the whole novel making his audience feel very sorry for this young child. And then at the end it's important that Dickens is saying, well, this child is, you know, unrespectable within our society, but also you have felt for him, and so you should have done, and he deserves happiness and he deserves to have a good life. And also, crucially, his legitimate half-brother, Mr. Monks, is evil, and Mr. Monks may be the one that Victorian society would view as respectable because he is legitimate and Oliver is not, but Mr. Monks is clearly immoral in comparison to Oliver, who is much more kind of pure, I suppose. I feel like maybe one of the reasons why I find Oliver Twist quite frustrating as a character is because he is very, very pure, and that's kind of the point, but also it means he is a little bit dull to read about sometimes. I feel like there's also a lot of interesting things going on in Oliver Twist in terms of like London versus the countryside. I feel like the way Dickens writes about London in Oliver Twist is really great and is really engaging, and that kind of like seedy underworld of London is really well kind of characterised, I suppose. And I feel like maybe that is one of the reasons why Oliver Twist does have this like staying power, and one of the reasons why it has, why it is one of Dickens's most famous books, is because the way it looks at London and the kind of criminal gang scene in London is really really interesting and feels so very 19th century, I suppose. And then the way that's contrasted with the countryside in the chapters where Oliver goes to live with Rose and Mrs. Maylie in this kind of much more like pastoral place. I feel like that is quite interesting to look at. And the kind of contrast of like the purity of the countryside and the kind of like danger and sin of the city, I think is quite interesting. But at the same time, obviously, the workhouse where Oliver has been brought up is outside of London and is, I think, a small town, but it's kind of in a more rural area, and that is also a place where things are not good. And Mr. Brownlow lives in London, which is a place where things are good. So you have the kind of city-country divide, but it doesn't quite equate with bad and good, which I think is quite interesting too. Obviously, I've spoken a little bit already about the social criticism within Oliver Twist, but I feel like it probably is one of the most interesting things about the book. The way Dickens criticises the workhouse, obviously, one of the things that Oliver Twist is very famous as a book for, and is something that is really interesting. Interestingly, a little while ago I read an essay by Dickens. I can't remember which of his non-fiction books it was in, but I can probably find out and I'll put it down below. But Dickens wrote this non-fiction piece about going to visit a workhouse, and it's much more balanced than Oliver Twist. And he was basically what he was arguing in this essay was that the people working in the workhouse were doing their best, but they have so little funding that there's only so much they can do. So the conditions are awful, but the people who work there are trying. And obviously that is very different from Oliver Twist, where like everyone who works at the workhouse is just evil. And I found that quite interesting when I read the essay a few years ago, to kind of compare that to Oliver Twist and how different it was. I don't know at what point in his career that essay was written, but again, if I find out, then I'll put it down below in the description. But I feel like the social criticism in a lot of Oliver Twist is really interesting, partly to do with the workhouse, but actually I would say more to do with the kind of gang in London and why these people are in this situation. Because I feel like some of the really interesting themes in Oliver Twist are to do with poverty and sort of like who is to blame, and the fact that it is society that is to blame, not the characters, for what is happening. And I feel like you can especially see this in the way that Nancy and Bill are portrayed. I feel like the scene where Bill kills Nancy is like the best scene in Oliver Twist by quite a long way, and I feel like it is very well written, and Bill and Nancy are like the most interesting characters, I think. She says to him, "Spare my life, the love of heaven, as I spared yours. Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. I think of all I have given up only this one night for you. You shall have time to think of it and save yourself this crime. I will not lose my hold. You cannot throw me off. Bill, for God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you smell my blood. I have been true to you, upon my guilty soul I have. The gentleman and that dear lady told me tonight of a home in some foreign country where I could end my days in solitude and peace. Let me see them again and beg them on my knees to show the same mercy and goodness to you, and let us both leave this dreadful place and far apart lead better lives and forget how we have lived except in prayers and never see each other more. It is never too late to repent. They told me so. I feel it now, but we must have time." I feel like it's very clear within Oliver Twist that Dickens views Nancy as blameless, but I also think to a certain extent he believes that society is more to blame than Bill Sikes for the person that Bill Sikes is. And I think it's really key that kind of within the gang in London we have sort of like multiple generations. Fagin is an older man, Bill is slightly younger, and Nancy's slightly younger still, and then we have the kind of children, the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates, and we kind of see how generation to generation they turn each other into criminals and they turn each other into thieves. And Charlie Bates and the Artful Dodger have been made thieves by Bill Sikes and Fagin. Bill Sikes has been made a thief by Fagin. Nancy talks at one point about how Fagin has brought her up to her profession. Whether that means thieving things or whether that means sex work, it's hard to tell. I feel like it's very unclear always with Nancy and Oliver Twist, because basically for the Victorians, the line between being a sex worker and being someone who had sex outside of marriage. Like, they didn't really think there was a line. So it's very hard to tell within Oliver Twist whether Nancy is supposed to be a prostitute or whether Nancy just lives with Bill Sikes and she's not married. And the one time where Nancy talks about her trade, where she says, I've been in the same trade and the same service for 12 years since, she is talking about being a thief. That's what she's been talking about just before. And actually, I have just realised in that passage, she says that she has been a thief for 12 years since she was not half as old as Oliver. So I think that does mean Nancy is about 17 or 18 years old. This is a very tangential way of me saying that I feel like one of the very interesting things about Oliver Twist is that Dickens takes this gang of criminals and says, this is what society has made them into. And Oliver Twist has been brought up in the workhouse and is taken to live amongst thieves. And he is able to escape becoming a thief because he is, you know, conveniently adopted by wealthy people. But actually, the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates don't get that chance. Nancy did not get that chance. Bill Sikes did not get that chance. And so they are kind of made into criminals and made, in Bill Sikes' case, made brutal, made into a murderer by the society in which they live. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about the end of Oliver Twist is that the Artful Dodger doesn't really get any redemption, but Charlie Bates does, because he won't hide Bill Sikes when he hears that Bill has killed Nancy. He is so shocked, and this is such another level of crime, and he doesn't want to be part of it, and so he says, I'll give you up. And I think that's actually like a really fantastic moment in the book, which is one of the reasons why I was thinking more about Charlie Bates this time, because I feel like he is not a character who is considered very important in Oliver Twist, but actually I think that point towards the end is really important, because actually maybe Charlie could have been a better person too, and actually maybe if Charlie had had the same random convenient opportunities that Oliver had, Charlie could have also become better, and maybe there is hope for Charlie. I think the way that kind of Dickens looks at the fact that these people don't really have any other option and there is no other path in life, and so this is what's happened to them, I think that is quite interesting. I've been thinking a lot about like Fagin and Bill Sikes and the dynamic between them, because I feel like they're quite an interesting pair. I feel like Fagin is very much the more intelligent one and the older one. I think you definitely get the impression that Fagin has brought up Bill to be a burglar and a housebreaker, much as he is bringing up the Artful Dodger to be a thief and a pickpocket. Bill Sikes has kind of learnt from Fagin, and Fagin kind of is the more powerful one in that sense. Fagin is definitely the cleverer of the two. Is Fagin the more immoral one of the two? I think it's very difficult because, like I said, it's very difficult to separate Fagin's kind of characterization as a character from the anti-Semitism that runs through the book. But I feel like both Fagin and Bill Sikes' reaction to Nancy's betrayal is really, really interesting. And also they have this kind of discussion where does Fagin tell Bill to kill Nancy, or does he tell her not to kill Nancy? I think it's a really interesting scene. You won't be too violent, Bill? The day was breaking, and there was light enough for the men to see each other's faces. They exchanged one brief glance. There was fire in the eyes of both which could not be mistaken. I mean, said Fagin, showing that he felt all disguise was now useless, not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold. So I think he basically does tell him to kill Nancy, but he tells him to do it in a sensible way so that he's not immediately discovered and hung. I think that's meant to be what's happening there. So I think that's quite interesting because, in a way, we feel like Bill is the one that we see do the more horrific thing, but also he does partly do it with Fagin's influence. And also we kind of get the impression that he's been brought up by Fagin to be the person that he is. I feel like the chapter of Nancy's death and the chapters that follow are the strongest. I feel like Bill Sikes kind of running and not really knowing what to do and kind of like tormented by what he has done is really interesting, especially I feel like because the speech that Nancy makes to him before he kills her is she basically like claims equality between them and says, we've both had this terrible life, but we could lead a different life, and these people might help us. They can help both of us, they can help you too. And she kind of like brings an equality between them, even though previously in their relationship, you know, he's the one with more power, but actually she kind of claims equality with him, and then he kills her. And I feel like that is so awful, but also then what follows and how he can't really move forward, and he's kind of tormented by what he's done, I think is really interesting. And the fact that like Bill accidentally hangs himself when he thinks he can see kind of Nancy's eyes haunting him is obviously so important because he is basically hanged for her murder. Just he does it himself rather than it being done by the law, which I think is really interesting and a kind of very powerful moment. I do feel like there's just so much great stuff like at the end of Oliver Twist, but it's just not as great all the way through. Anyway, I don't think there's too much else I have to say. I feel like this has been a very rambly video. I feel like it's been much more rambly than my video about the Pickwick Papers, but there we go. Hopefully this has been vaguely interesting in some way. I did really enjoy reading Oliver Twist. It was nice to read it again, even though it is definitely not my favourite of Dickens's books. I still do think it's an interesting book, and I do think there are some fantastic chapters towards the end especially, but yes, it's just not my favourite one. But I am really looking forward to next month's book, which I will make another video on pretty soon introducing, and yeah, I hope you all had a good time reading Oliver Twist this month. Please do let me know down in the comments what you thought, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.